flowers and repulsive weeds. So I often wonder whether his headquarters were landscaped, whether he went out towards Gladeville in search of the Tennessee purple coneflower, that sort of thing. I don't know. Never found anything like that, but he was quite the character. Here's an interesting wartime shot. Again, I wish it was bigger, but you can see here's where it was taken from, in what direction. You can see in the distance there's a darker background and a lighter background. Between that is the Cumberland River. You can see the big timber structures on top of the bastions, which are topped by dirt, sod, and earthworks. You can see some soldiers there. One is standing at attention. One is shouldering his rifle with his hand in his pocket. There's another soldier sitting here pondering the meaning of life. Here you can see are the ends of railroad rails that were lined up and stacked together to protect the casemate there. There's at least 4 railroad lines here. There's a cemetery down here. The city cemetery is over there. You can clearly see the 2 limestone buildings at the University of Nashville, one of which is still standing. And if you magnify that photograph and look carefully, you can see a lot of different things. This map just shows generally where St. Cloud Hill and Fort Negley is, and where all the turnpikes and railroad lines converge into Nashville. So it was a very imposing, elevated vantage point. Military authorities in Nashville wasted little time enforcing or impressing any and all freedmen and contrabands to work on the fortifications. Federal patrols would seize barbershops and other places of business to round up workers. Cavalrymen surrounded black churches during Sunday services and grabbed any able-bodied celebrant that they could muster. Soon Morton had the labor force he needed to build the forts, especially Fort Negley, which was built in record time considering its size and complexity. At times, there were 4,000 soldiers and 2,000 impressed freedmen and contrabands working the site. The contraband camp at the site, containing 2,000 persons, had very few facilities to house or shelter the workers who slept on the grounds. Sanitation was poor, meals were minimal, and disease made the rounds. Eventually, 600 to 800 black laborers would perish from the hard work, disease, and exposure to the elements. The dead were likely buried below the southern slope of St. Cloud Hill. There were 2,771 names on the labor rolls of free and impressed blacks working at Fort Negley from August 62 to April 63. Only about 310 men were ever compensated for their work. Slaves, contrabands, and impressed freedmen laboring to build Fort Negley in 1862 begged their superiors to arm them against threats of Confederate cavalry attacks. They wished to protect themselves, their families, and the fort that they were building, but they were refused. So they armed themselves with axes, picks, and shovels. As it turned out, they didn't need to use them, but these Negro laborers arming themselves represented perhaps the first black soldiers of the Civil War, according to the museum director at Fort Negley Park. Oh, I wanted to point out that the 2 men on the left are U.S. colored troops. They're sergeants displaying their stripes. Officers above that rank were all white. And then on the right here, of course, you can see him standing right out here. This is from the Nashville National Cemetery, showing this statue of the U.S. colored troops infantrymen. That's actually Bill Radcliffe modeling for that. In 1868, what remained of a magazine at Old Fort Negley was used by the local den of the Ku Klux Klan for meetings led by Grand Wizard Nathan Bedford Forrest. According to newspaper accounts, the Klan was determined to terrorize and threaten the residents of Rocktown, a black neighborhood which had grown from the remnants of the old wartime contraband camp. Leander Woods, who was a veteran of the U.S. colored troops, formed a 50-man militia in the neighborhood, drilled them on St. Cloud Hill, and worked to counteract the KKK. On or about February 25th, 1869, Forrest led Klan members to the fort, where they burned their robes and officially disbanded, believing that the Klan had served its purpose. By the way, these robes, which are very different, elaborate, found those in the Tennessee State Museum. This is another picture of Fort Negley, big gun, and you notice the gun is aimed towards the town, and that these these soldiers are posing on a wooden naval gun carriage, which leads us to believe that at first they took naval guns from gunboats up to Fort Negley until they were replaced with proper artillery. Here is the #1 casemate at Fort Negley. You can see the elaborate stonework. You can see the iron rails protecting it. If you squint, you can see infantrymen posing inside. Inside is a big 30-pounder Parrott rifle that we were talking about before. You can see another heavy gun there on the gun platform. I forgot to mention on that other photograph that the artillerymen slept in tents inside the fort so that they would be close to their guns. Most of the other garrison was camped around the fort on the hill. This shot is extremely interesting because right here, the light colored part, that's Fort Morton. And there's very few photographs of any of the other forts in Nashville. What's really interesting is if you look closely, there's no wagons, there's no soldiers, there's no tents up there, there's no sign of activity at all. So it might have been a break during the construction. This is from the Official Records Atlas. This is a diagram of Fort Morton. Fort Morton was an elaborate fortification built in 1862 on Curry Hill, which is bare limestone, now the site of Rose Hill. It was designed by Morton to hold more heavy guns than Fort Negley, 14 versus 11, and was literally too complicated to build according to its original design. This and the lack of adequate labor, in addition to other priorities, delayed work on this fort and required much more funding than anticipated. Just as a side note, Morton pretty much left Nashville in 1863, and he was killed in combat on June 17, 1864, in Petersburg, Virginia. He was shot in the head by a sharpshooter as he was scouting the front lines. This is the diagram of Blockhouse Casino on Casino Hill. Timber reinforced blockhouse, small fort with earthen parapets. It was built because of its elevation over the Franklin Pike. In August of 1889, the city completed construction of a new reservoir that could hold more than 50 million gallons of water. A little after midnight on November 5th, 1912, the southeast wall broke loose and sent 25 million gallons of water roaring into the adjacent neighborhood. Some of the houses were swept off their foundations, but nobody was killed, quite miraculously. If you go up there today, of course you can't get close enough today, but it used to be you go up there and see exactly where that break took place. They rebuilt it, of course. Fort Houston was built in '63 and named for Russell Houston, who was a Union sympathizer and owner of the land on which it was built. Houston allowed his home to be blown up to make way for the fort. Now that's dedication. The fort was designed to hold more than 35 guns. It was renamed Fort Dan McCook, that's McCook there, Brigadier General Dan McCook, who was also killed at Kennesaw Mountain in July of 1864. Again, the name really didn't stick. None of the fortifications exist today. The site is now the Music Row traffic roundabout. Here's hill number 210. I don't know if you noticed that on the interior line of works, but this was built in 1864 because, according to a report, an enemy, the Confederates, could fire at long range into the suburbs of the city and could make the Cumberland Hospital and large storehouses on the Northwestern Railroad untenable, so they put a rather large battery up there. This is Fort Gillem. Gillem on the left, Sill on the right was named for Brigadier General Alvin Gillem, who supervised construction of the fort. It was renamed Fort Sill for Brigadier General Joshua Sill, who was killed at the Battle of Stones River near Murfreesboro. It was built as an earthworks fortification with a strong central blockhouse. It is now located on the site of Jubilee Hall at Fisk University, which is a national historic landmark. Gillem was a native of Gainesboro. He's one of only 6 Tennesseans to serve as a Union general. And we move on to Fort Whipple, named in honor of Brigadier General William D. Whipple. On the top there, he was George Thomas's chief of staff. It was built in 1864, also known as Redoubt Donaldson, in honor of the city's quartermaster, Brigadier General James Donaldson. It's spelled different than Fort Donaldson. Donaldson was a native of Baltimore and a West Point graduate. He was chief quartermaster of the Department of the Cumberland from November 63 to June 65. He organized his men of the quartermaster's organization into a combat unit and served in the Battle of Nashville. Donaldson efficiently and effectively managed the huge supply bases that served the armies of Grant, Sherman, and Thomas and received their commendations in the official reports. He's probably one of the best unsung heroes of the Civil War. We move on to Fort Qureshi, also known as the fort at Hyde's Ferry. It's named in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Julius Qureshi, who was killed at the Battle of Stones River. It was built as a polygonal earthworks with 14 guns. Qureshi was a native of Havana, Cuba. He served as Rosecrans' chief of staff. Late on the afternoon of December 31st at Murfreesboro, Rosecrans, Qureshi, and his staff watched Breckinridge's final charge from a knoll in full view of both sides. Suddenly, a Confederate shell whistled past the commander's head and decapitated Qureshi. The headless body continued on horseback for another 20 paces before slumping to the ground with blood splattering all over Rosecrans. General Sheridan was there. He recalled that this horrible public death stunned us all, and a momentary expression of horror spread over Rosecrans' face. But at such time, the importance of self-control was vital, and he pursued his course with an appearance of indifference. If you go to Stones River, they have a little marker that shows exactly where that happened. He lost his head in combat. Bad joke. A large redoubt was planned for the east bank near the L&N Railroad Bridge in Nashville, but it was never completed. You can see how elaborate it was. The redoubt was most likely located near Foster Street intersection with the railroad. Much more interesting. Federal engineers built a massive gunpowder magazine in Nashville, completed in the summer of 1864. The exact site is not known, but it was on the site of the 8 acres formerly occupied by the city hospital, which burned down in February of 1863. General Zelius B. Tower was in charge of fortifications in Nashville in 1864, and he wrote, "The engineer department has built a Grand Depot magazine, the largest and best devised that I have ever seen. Its interior measurement is 150 by 60, that's 9,000 square foot. High, airy, and well ventilated, solidly constructed, and lighted at either end by locomotive reflectors placed in small masonry rooms. The structure is covered with earth to a depth of 8 feet. A covered roadway with stone masonry sidewalls passes through the embankment and communicates with the magazine entrance. A solid trestle-work branch railroad from the main track quantities of fixed ammunition in transit. And it's very interesting, like they said, they had reflectors in these small chambers at each side of the gunpowder magazine so that it would not blow up. You can see at the top the earth covering, and you see the ventilators going up there, and then the access at both sides, wagons and a railroad. It was a very badly needed facility in Nashville for safety's sake. Here are some of the conclusions that I came to during the research on these forts in Nashville. And I want to read from Tower's report in October of 1864, which was 2 months before the Battle of Nashville. And remember, the forts planned were entirely too large to be speedily built. When General Morton, of course he was captain at the time, Morton commenced on the defenses of Nashville, great numbers of blacks could be obtained at small wages. It is probable that he expected to carry out his system by cheap labor. The enlisting of the Negroes into the U.S. colored troops broke up this arrangement, and an uncommon mortality among them interfered with the progress of the system. How dare they die? Both General Morton and Captain Burroughs, his assistant, while in charge of the Nashville works, were frequently required elsewhere. Colonel Merrill, charge of engineering operations in the Department of the Cumberland, had scarcely had time to inspect his post. So what I'm getting at is that most of these fortifications weren't even built until 1864, as Hood came towards Nashville in the Battle of Nashville. These fortifications were never attacked. Negley's other masterpiece, Fortress Rosecrans, a massive depot in Murfreesboro, was built of earthworks. He got to build his fort of earthworks. That was never attacked. They were that formidable. We're going to talk a little bit, first we're going to see that Nashville was fortified second only to Washington, D.C., and it was a distant second, because Washington, D.C. had 1,400 gun emplacements, 68 forts, and 93 batteries. You couldn't get in, basically. We're going to talk about federal logistics and the federal infrastructure. This is a schematic map that I did of the supply chain, you might call it, from Louisville down to Nashville, down to Chattanooga, down to Atlanta. You can see the railroad lines and the rivers that supplied all the supplies to the armies at the front. Those little block houses along the railroads are just symbolic. I think there were 160 of those block houses built within this territory here by the end of the war. And this is the main Nashville and Chattanooga depot in Nashville. You can see all the locomotives there. They did a lot of locomotive work there. A lot of mechanics from the north were stationed there. A lot of railroad work. And here's just a schematic of Colonel Merrill's plans for the blockhouses along the railroads. Quite simple, very sturdy, and they were made so that the engineers would build about half of it, and then the garrison station there could finish off the rest of it. I usually just read from this, but railroad work completed. Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, 148 miles of track, 42 bridges. Louisville and Nashville in 1864 alone, almost 3,000 tons of new rail and 471 tons of re-rolled rail, 96,709 cross ties. Nashville and Decatur, 34 miles of track rebuilt with 41 bridges. And the Nashville and Northwestern, 50 miles of track, 107,000 cross ties, 44 bridges, more than 4 miles long, 4.1 million feet of lumber, 34 structures, including 14 at Johnsonville. It's another 1.8 million feet of lumber, and 742,200 shingles. I don't know who the guy was that sat there and counted each shingle, but Cost of railroad building and maintenance for the first 9 months of 1864 totaled $30 million, which is $500 million in today's money. I'm going to quote from this gentleman here. I think you all recognize him. The Atlantic campaign would simply have been impossible without the use of railroads. From Louisville to Nashville, 185 miles. Nashville to Chattanooga, 151 miles. And from Chattanooga to Atlanta, 137 miles. Our trains from Nashville forward were operating under military rules and ran about 10 miles per hour in gangs of 4 trains of 10 cars each. 4 such groups of trains daily made 160 cars, 10 tons each, 1,600 tons, which exceeded the absolute necessity of the Army and allowed for accidents that were common and inevitable. That single stem of railroad, 473 miles long, supplied an army of 100,000 men and 35,000 animals for a period of 196 days from May 1st to November 12th. And he calculated that if they had used roads and wagons, it would have taken 36,800 wagons. The Atlanta campaign was an impossibility without these railroads, and only then because we had the men and means to defend them in addition to what were necessary to overcome the enemy. And he did make it to Atlanta and captured it. I couldn't resist putting this Far Side cartoon in there, the Atlanta campaign. March to the sea. You're supposed to stop at the sea, not keep marching. Nashville was changed during the war. According to historian Thomas Flagle, the war had mutated the vibrant center of commerce and higher education into an odoriferous, crowded military base of cheerless earthworks, careworn edifices, and morbid hospitals. Especially for the rural boys, it all had the feel of a dark, satanic mill. If I can turn this page. During his brief stay, Corporal John Leake of the 92nd Illinois wrote, "Mother, this is a forsaken-looking country. It don't look like it was worth fighting for. The country is stripped of everything but the hills." Here's the main wharf at Nashville and the steamboats lined up there. It was said at one time they had 50 steamboats unloading their wares onto the wharf. In 1863, 70% of the supplies reaching Nashville came by steamboat. Each boat made the 192-mile trip between Smithland and Nashville in 39 hours upstream and 20 hours downstream. Convoys of several dozen freighters usually required an escort of at least 4 tin-clad gunboats. Typical steamboat would burn 36 cords of wood at 5 miles per cord and refueled 4 times. There were 20 wood yards between Smithland and Nashville. Brigadier General Lewis Parsons is quartermaster at St. Louis. For the fiscal year ending July 30th, 1863, he estimated that steamboats brought 136,000 troops and 338 million pounds of goods through Nashville. Here's another look at the Nashville Wharf. You can see the suspension bridge in the background there. We talked about Quartermaster Donaldson. He said in a report, "For weeks, my levee thronged with transports of all sorts and a force of at least 3,000 men and 400 to 500 teams were kept constantly at work day and night, Sundays and weekdays, in transferring the supplies to my various depots and storehouses. My estimate is that for 3 months or more, I received and handled daily an average of 2,000 to 3,000 tons of freight, exclusive of the amount arriving here by railroad." In many respects, the federal quartermasters were the unsung heroes of the war. They were indispensable cogs in the nation's war machine, according to historian Lynette Taylor, the biographer of Captain Simon Perkins, an assistant quartermaster at Nashville. Long hours, multiple jobs, immense responsibilities, rare favorable recognition, and stagnation in rank were the realities of the quartermaster's position. Everything they needed to know had to be learned on the job. Now, just as reference, one steamboat can carry 500 to 600 tons of cargo. That's pretty much the upper limit. That is the equivalent of 125 railroad cars, or 5 to 6 trains. It's also the equivalent of 250 wagons, each requiring 6 mules, requiring 15 tons of feed per day. That's just the equivalent of one steamboat. So you can see what the most efficient way of moving cargo was, and all those came right past here, down to Nashville. This is a picture of the Taylor Depot, commissary warehouse for food supplies at the south end of the Nashville and Decatur Railroad Station at 5th Avenue and Broadway. A composite photograph showing the south side on the left and the rear of the building on the right. It measured 519 by 190, which is 100,000 square foot. And the railroad side of it would be on the other side that we can't see. This is the wagon side here. 2 stories, very sturdily built. See the elaborate downspouts. They collected water in barrels there and used it in case the depot caught on fire. This is the Eaton Depot down near Fort Negley, another big supply depot on the railroad. All these led down to Fortress Rosecrans in Murfreesboro eventually. Just for comparison, this is east of Nashville and I-40 and Interstate 840. Every rectangle there is a warehouse or storehouse. This little rectangle here is 1.3 million square foot. So you can see that's a lot of storage space. Nashville is still centrally located to the eastern United States and still a logistics center. These are the 1st Michigan Engineers, led by Colonel Innes, and Colonel Morton led the Pioneer Brigade, combat engineers after he built the forts in Nashville. On October 24th, 1862, Rosecrans replaced Buell as commander of the Army of the Cumberland. A former engineer, Rosecrans created the Pioneer Brigade, led by Morton, to build roads and fortifications and to repair railroads. Their first role as combat engineers was at the Battle of Stones River. Commanding the brigade along with Stokes' Chicago Board of Trade battery, Morton successfully held off several Confederate assaults and protected the Nashville Pike from capture. Following the battle, Morton supervised the building of the massive depot at Murfreesboro called Fortress Rosecrans. About at this same time, the 1st Michigan was in Laverne and held off several Confederate cavalry attacks by Wharton. They kind of circled the wagon, basically, and held their position. Led by Colonel Innes, given the chance to give up, Innes replied, "We don't surrender much." A point of contention between the Michigan Engineers, who were volunteers, and Morton's Pioneer Brigade, who were professional engineers, was the building of the Nashville and Decatur Railroad Bridge over the Elk River near the Alabama line. The bridge was had to be 470 feet long and 60 feet tall. The Corps of Engineers stated they could erect the structure in 3 weeks. Innes countered by figuring 10 days. Rosecrans gave the job to the Wolverines, who proceeded to build the bridge in 7 days. It's just amazing what these guys could do. It's amazing what anybody can do when they're motivated. The Pioneer Brigade historian Jeffrey Blankenmeyer summed it up. What the Army of the Ohio could not achieve in August of 1862 under General Buell, they were able to achieve as the Army of the Cumberland under General Rosecrans the following year. That campaign qualifies as one of the most remarkable feats for any unit of military engineers. It's unfortunate, but history tends to shed its brightest lights on the fighting units. And that's pretty much it. There's me leading a tour of Fort Negley during the good old COVID days. But if you have any questions or anything, I'd be glad to try and answer them. And I appreciate your attention.
burn greenwood or?
I don't think they burned greenwood, but they had, all these wood guards along the rivers that the garrisons. A lot of the times the garrisons, a lot of times they were black soldiers, in the blockhouses and forts would go out and, that's what they do every day, is cut down wood and stack it for the steamboats. Of course, they also had, water towers also.
Okay.
And they had that for the railroads also. Although the railroads mostly burn coal. Steamboats could burn both, but mostly wood.
Okay.
These big ironclads, what was it, 5 miles per ton of coal, I believe. A lot of them would tow their own coal barges behind them.
Wow.
Yeah, they burned so much coal. A lot of times they would be lashed together or lashed to a tin clad or something like that, and basically just towed, like a big tank being towed to the front or something like
Last question. How long did it take you to write this book?
that. 24 years.
Okay.
I got real interested in 1999, went on a tour of all the sites in Fort Negley. Of course, it wasn't open to the public at that time. And just got kind of interested in fortifications. And I've always been interested in the infrastructure and the logistics and how they manage to move all those supplies to the Army at the front, the beans and the bullets. An Army moves on its stomach, as they say, which is true. And they also say that, whichever Army produces the most is the one that wins.
Right.
The battle's over before it's fought.
Thank you very much.
Sure. I noticed somebody had mentioned repeater rifles, the same thing. It's a modern technology. Confederates were fighting with muskets, and the Federals had the repeater rifles. Who's going to win?
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Any comments or questions? Yes, ma'am.
As far as the river goes, there's a point in the river at some point between Clarksville and Nashville where it's really
Harpeth Shoals.
yes.
Down there in Nashville City.
So that made Clarksville a rather large part of this supply chain.
Yeah, a lot of times, if the Cumberland River was down, which it probably 6 months out of the year, they would just take wagons up there and unload the steamboats, and the wagons would take it to Nashville. But that was a big reason why they built